After 12 films and 2 phases of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, they entered 2016 big. It was on track to become one of the biggest franchises in history, it had a ton of movies that did amazingly critically and at the box office, and it was just really, really big. Sure, the second phase of the MCU had growing pains, but coming into 2016, I, and a lot of other people, had no clue what to expect. And I'm really happy with what we got. Now, I don't want to sound like a broken record here because a ton of people have already made this point, but Captain America Civil War kind of feels more like an Avengers movie than a Captain America movie at times. Now, don't get me wrong, Steve is still clearly the main character, but I think the movie also has a great deal of focus on Tony, and it's actually a better culmination to Phase 2 than it is for the start of Phase 3. First of all, there's an actual status quo change here. After Age of Ultron, everything kept going on like normal, really, which I guess isn't a bad thing, but the fact that this is the start of Phase 3 kind of makes it feel weird that this is the one to have the giant status quo change and not the end of the prior phase. It's got Bucky and other ramifications from S.H.I.E.L.D. falling in it from the Winter Soldier. It's got Ant-Man in it, which kind of works. I think it ties up Phase 2 so much better than it does start Phase 3. And it's also just a really, really good film. I love the drama with the characters. I love how a lot of it is simple and subtle, and it's never really in your face. I love the arc that pretty much everyone goes through. Tony here is just as good as he was in Iron Man 3, and I think a lot of the problems that I had with him in Age of Ultron are pretty much gone here. I think that he's right back to the type of character that I really, really love. The action scenes are also fantastic. I really love the airport fight, and I love the fight between Steve and Bucky and Tony as well. I just love how the movie's also able to introduce Black Panther and Spider-Man without either one of them weighing down or taking anything away from the story itself. Those two characters being introduced, I'm sure you could argue, make this feel like it should be the start of a phase, but I still feel like since this ends up with the Avengers broken up and such a bleak point, that we probably should have ended off Phase 2 here, rather than beginning Phase 3 here. But overall, fantastic film, easily one of my favorite Marvel movies, and definitely one of Marvel's best up until this point. 4.5 stars, 94%. Due to the sheer volume of movies that I'm going to be talking about in this video, a lot of these movies are going to be kind of brushed over, unfortunately, and one of those movies that's going to be brushed over is Doctor Strange. Mainly because Marvel origins are boring at this point, and I think that is a simple fact. This movie also does nothing new with the formula either, which really drags it down. There's definitely positives here. For one, the characters are pretty fun. Benedict Cumberbatch is amazing as Stephen Strange, and I really do like his character a lot. He's basically the same as Tony Stark, but I think he's still really fun, and his arc, while again, like Tony Stark, is just as good as Tony Stark's. The Ancient One's pretty cool, and I really adore Wong, but the villain's kind of bad. He's not the worst, again, that's still Ronan, but he's pretty forgettable, and I just don't think he really adds anything to the film. I literally never think about him unless I'm thinking about Doctor Strange, and even when I'm thinking about Doctor Strange, I really can't figure out the villain's name. The visuals and the final act are fun, so I think it all comes together at the end to be a fairly alright to good movie, and I really wouldn't have an issue watching it again. It's just completely evident by this point that the MCU was kind of running out of ideas for solo films, but it's still a good movie overall, probably on the level of something like the first Thor. I give it 3.5 stars and a 74%. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 is the perfect sequel. It is literally up there with movies like The Empire Strikes Back for me in terms of doing everything the first movie did well, but better. It's visually stunning, the score is amazing, the choice of songs for the soundtrack is wonderful, and all of the acting is so good here. It's got some of the saddest and most impactful moments in the entire MCU for me, and I love every emotional bit so much. Yondu's death is phenomenal. I love his funeral. I love the entire build-up to the end of the film. It's just a movie that I didn't expect to be as emotional as it is, and yet it's still a really fun and funny movie. Unlike a lot of MCU movies, I think the emotional moments work well because of the jokes. They use the jokes to set off the emotional and serious moments, and it works so well with the tremendous payoff. And sure, some of the jokes aren't too funny, and a lot of them go on for way too long, but the ones that are still funny, I think are genuinely hilarious. I also think that Ego is a brilliant villain, and he's definitely the best the MCU has up until this movie. He's played amazingly by Kurt Russell, and he's just such a fantastic antagonist to the Guardians, and I love the bombshell reveal that we get that he killed Peter's mother, and I love how it leads into one of the most exciting and fun climaxes in the MCU. Of course, there are some flaws. I genuinely think the pacing is pretty bad in this movie. Gets the central plot going way too fast, and then the entire last hour is the climax. And while I mentioned the climax is good and exciting, some of the moments are a little boring, and I think the middle of the movie is tiresome, and that's where most of the really awful and bad jokes are wedged in there. But I think at the end of the day, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 is utterly amazing. I genuinely love this film. It's one of the few MCU films that I could watch consistently, and I could even put on my favorites of all time list. It's close to being a masterpiece, but not quite there. I'm gonna go ahead and give it 4.5 stars with like a 97%. If the jokes were a little bit better, I could probably love this movie even more, but right now I just think it's a pretty amazing film.
Spider-Man Homecoming is a bad movie because Spider-Man in it is obsessed with Tony Stark, and he's not his own character, and he uses dumb AI to do dumb things and keeps saying Mr. Stark. This film fundamentally misunderstands Spider-Man and continues to do so. It also murdered my family in cold blood and then ate their bodies for dinner.
I am entirely kidding, of course, because this movie fucking rocks. I love how down-to-earth this movie is. I love that it's basically a high school film disguised as a superhero movie. I love that the high school elements are really awesome and entertaining. Peter's relationships with his friends is wonderful, and I think his dynamic with Aunt May is really good. I also think the villain is completely standout. Vulture is awesome, and his scene in the car with Peter is fantastic. He's definitely, once again, one of the best MCU villains, just like Ego was. I also really do like Tony here. I love the subtle moments where you can tell he really does care a lot about Peter, and I love how his character feels like a natural progression from Iron Man 3 and Civil War to here. I was really worried that they were going to revert him again, but they didn't, and it's a really awesome inclusion. Is he overused in some regards? Yeah, but does it bother me? Not really. The movie is just really fun. It has some phenomenal action scenes. It's got some of the best Spider-Man moments that I've seen in a movie, and I love the character arc that Peter ends up going through. I think the only real issues that I have with the movie is that the middle of it kind of drags and just feels a little bit unnecessary. I think it would have been fixed if they shaved it off a bit, but it's still really fun MCU movie and a really fun Spider-Man movie, and such a great kickoff to this character's first full film in this universe. Go ahead and give it 4 stars with an 87% because it's still a really great film, and if you haven't seen it, go watch it, and if you hate it, I'm sorry that I don't hate it too. They're cranking out 3 of these bitches a year now? Damn. Anyway, Thor Ragnarok is the only good Thor movie. Next question. Oh, you guys are still here? Let me talk about why this is the best Thor movie. The first reason is, it's interesting. The second reason is, it's actually got a good story that holds my interest for more than just a couple scenes and actually goes on for the entire runtime. How unheard of is that in a Thor movie? I just really love how fun this movie is. Like the Guardians movies, it's definitely trying to tap into being more of a comic book property, and it's not worried about seeming weird, it's just being its own thing. It's a comic book movie. I love what the movie does for Thor's character. It turns him from a boring character that I didn't really care about into a far more interesting and relatable character that can actually carry movies, unlike the previous version. I also feel the same way about the Hulk here. This is another character that I didn't think had much potential, and he didn't really have anything deep or much depth at all, and yet here he's genuinely interesting and fun, and I think he's really great here. I love how they're setting up some stuff with Banner in the next few movies, and I'm really excited to see where that goes when I watch this. There's definitely some issues, and I think the first half of the movie's pretty bloated and a tad bit poorly paced. I love elements of it, but it's definitely the movie at its worst, and I also think that Asgard stuff is a little hit or miss. The climax is phenomenal, but it just brings me back to the boringness of the previous 2 films, and I can't really bring myself to care too much. But otherwise, Thor Ragnarok is a ridiculously fun movie that comes together tremendously by the end, and it's still got some damn good moments that don't just depend on being fun. It is the best Thor movie, easily. At least until the next one, I guess. 4.5 stars and a 94%. First of all, I want to say that no matter what I say about this movie, Chadwick Boseman was a fantastic actor, and he brought so much love and joy to these films, and the loss of him will impact the MCU in ways that we have no way of knowing for right now. He was a terrific actor in person, and he will definitely be missed greatly. As for the film, Black Panther is a film that I think is simultaneously overrated, as well as being entirely overhated. The movie has a lot of great elements that I really love, but also enough elements that I think sadly holds it back from being as good as it could be. I'll start with what I like, and I think that's got to be the characters. Pretty much every character in this movie, hero or villain, is really solid, especially Killmonger. He's he's such a brilliant villain. Claw is a great villain too, and I kind of like the split villain nature of this film. Usually when a comic book movie has two villains, they're teamed up until the final act, but here they're separated them throughout the film to split up the movie, and I think it worked well for the most part. The only character that I don't really enjoy too much here is sadly T'Challa. He just feels so lifeless and dull throughout the entire movie, and it's especially sad when he was so good in Civil War. There are some negatives. I really do have an issue with the two villains thing. While I think the split is cool and works nicely enough, I think that once we transition from Claw's half of the movie to Killmonger's half, it's not nearly as interesting and it just feels a little disjointed. There's a sharp veer in tone and plot as soon as Killmonger comes to Wakanda that just doesn't work too well for me. Killmonger is clearly the better villain, but he just seems to take up the lesser half of the film. It's still good, but there's a lot of tiny issues I have with it that just build up. My main issue comes from the point when T'Challa is presumed dead, and then he's just back way too quickly for the final fight with Killmonger. It just feels really rushed and pointless. Still though, I think that Black Panther is a really fun MCU movie, and one that I'll easily rewatch without a problem. And if it were to iron out some of its issues just a tiny bit, I think I could genuinely love it. But as of right now, it's just a really good MCU movie and has a lot of fun moments. So at the end of the day, 3.5 stars and 77%. Avengers Infinity War is not only the best MCU film, but one of my favorite films ever made. Because this movie should not work at all. And yet it not only works, it's absolutely fantastic. I'll start with the negatives first because it's easy for me to get through that since there's not really too many of them. First off, the character of Bruce Banner here is dog shit, and Mark Ruffalo delivers pretty much every line he has terribly. Next, the pacing's pretty bad. The movie just kind of jumps into it and never stops, and I get why they had to do that, and it's really exhilarating at times, but then other times it's just kind of jumbled because you'll spend so much time with another character that when you go back to another set of characters, you're like, oh yeah, I guess that's going on right now. There's also some really bad dialogue. Some jokes are atrocious, mostly from Bruce Banner, and it just felt like the writers were trying the best to emulate Joss Whedon, except they sucked at doing it, so it's just cringe. The movie also fumbles some character arcs set up in prior films. I mean, Thor just lost his eye and hammer, and he gets both back in this movie. And I get the hammer, he needs a weapon, but like, how hard was it just to have him not have his eye? And Peter turns down being an Avenger after having the Iron Spider suit given to him at the end of Homecoming, and now he's just an Avenger and has the Iron Spider suit. Like, okay. Sure, it makes sense since he goes to space because he gets wrapped up in everything, but it does feel a little disjointed. Alright, now you can take everything I just said and throw it out the fucking window because it doesn't matter. Those complaints that would normally hold back a movie and bring it down are the equivalent of minor nitpicks for me here because the rest of this movie is so good. I love every character in this film except for Bruce Banner. I love Tony the most, of course, because he's my favorite, but I think the film is phenomenal in every regard. Thanos is tremendous. His plan makes no sense and is inherently flawed, but like, I get where he's coming from, and the way he goes about it just makes him seem so vindicated when he gets what he wants done. I love Thor too. It takes everything from Ragnarok and makes it even better here, and I love the pairing with him and Rocket and Groot. I love him getting a new weapon, and the scene where he builds it is tremendous. The Guardians are really fun too, although they have some of the weakest jokes and moments, but I do really enjoy them. I love seeing them meet with Tony and Spider-Man and Doctor Strange, and I love how everything collides towards the end. Thor goes from being with the entire Guardians team to being with Rocket and Groot to eventually Wakanda, and the Guardians and Iron Man and Spider-Man Strange all end up together. The film just really finds its groove when these two sets of characters are doing stuff at once. It's just really great. The score is also fantastic. I think it's my favorite score in the MCU, and everything is just phenomenal about that. I also think the camera work is really good. Some people can complain about the color correction, and yeah, it looks kind of bad on Earth, but all the scenes in space look really tremendous, and again, there's some amazing shots and moments in here that I love so much. I've talked about this film for far too long. Just please watch Infinity War, but, you know, watch the previous films before it, or else it'll be a little bit confusing. 5 stars and a 100%, the perfect MCU movie. Ant-Man and the Wasp is a good movie. It is fun. It's better than the first one. It's got a lot of cool elements in it. I love Scott still. He's really good here. I love Scott's dynamic with his family. I think he's pretty fun in this movie. I love a lot of the jokes. There's some really funny moments. There's some really awful moments. Half the jokes are only really good because Paul Rudd's a fantastic comedic actor, and some of the writing is pretty good too. I also think the villain's pretty fun. She's sympathetic, and the actress playing her did a really good job. But the film does have some really bad comedy. It's shot like a boring TV show, and some of the characters are downright awful. I just think it does enough good things, and I think what it does with the quantum realm is really fun. I think that's the best part of the movie visually, because anytime we get to see that, I'm like, oh, the direction here isn't that boring. I think it could really lead to a fun third film in Quantumania, so I am kind of looking forward to that. At the end of the day though, this is a 3.5 star film with a 70%. It's almost on the same level as the first film with just being okay, but I found a lot of enjoyment in it and I could easily watch this again. I used to really like this movie. When I first saw it, I thought it was fine, then I watched it again and I really enjoyed it. Now, however, I just don't care. It's not terrible, it's not great, it's not even that good. It just kind of exists, and it's a Marvel film that feels like a Marvel film in pretty much every way imaginable. It feels like a Phase 1 film in the worst way. It legitimately feels like it belongs there. Not in the same way that Ant-Man feels like a Phase 1 film because it's not as interesting. No, Captain Marvel deadass feels like it belongs in 2011. Carol's fine. I don't hate her. I think she's genuinely just fine. Don't really care. Fury's cool, I like him, cool character, don't really care. The Korean Scroll War is lame, but there's a cool twist, I just don't care. The film is easily at its best when it's Carol and Fury having a buddy cop dynamic, and I think there's some cute family scenes spread out through the end too. I just wish I had more to say because this is probably the least interested I've been in an MCU film since The Incredible Hulk. Don't get me wrong, it's definitely better than that movie, but I simply don't really have anything to say. Except that Talos is really amazing. Also, I'm just now remembering this, but fucking Ronan is in this movie for some godforsaken reason, which is easily enough to bump it down a few points. 3 stars with a 62%. Make no mistake, this movie is not as good as Infinity War. It's really nowhere close. Infinity War is a fucking masterpiece of a blockbuster, and Endgame just kind of slides into the best of the MCU before Infinity War. People complain about this film being filled with fan service, but I think if any film deserves fan service, it's the one that took 10 years and 21 films to get to. I do genuinely love a lot about this film. I think the first hour is great, and I love the fallout of Infinity War. I love everything before the 5-year time skip, and I love a great deal of what comes after too. I just think seeing everyone fit into a new status quo was really awesome, and I honestly could have taken an entire movie of this part, and I really like the tone. I think the second act is probably the most muddled and worst part of the movie. It's full of a lot of scenes that go on too long, and the film starts to really feel its length. It's not nearly as awesome as it really could be. And the stuff on Vormir is just so bland. It's an utter copy and paste of the death of Gamora in Infinity War, and it's creatively uncreative and lazy. Natasha dies the exact same way for the exact same reason to the exact same song and the score in the exact same pose. It's just a redo, and if Gamora already felt like a fridged character, Natasha definitely does. That being said, the rest of the second act is awesome. I love the revisit to 2012. It's so epic. I love going to 1970, and Tony's scene with his father is really great. Thor's moments in Asgard are pretty fun, and I think they're incredible. Again, it's absolutely fan service, but like I said, if a series goes on for 10 years and 21 movies, it deserves a little fan service. The final hour is easily the best part of the film, in my opinion. From the second Bruce snaps his fingers to the death of Tony, it's an insanely fun and amazing ride that I just love so much. Steve grabbing the hammer is awesome. The snap is really cool. I just love Thanos' fight with the 3 of them, and the scene where all the portals show up is so awesome. Avengers Endgame is really a tremendous achievement in movie making and one of the best films in the MCU. It doesn't reach the heights of Infinity War, but when it does, it tops them for me. Sadly though, a lot of this movie just isn't as epic or as exciting as it was in the theater, because like I said, when Steve grabbed Mjolnir in the cinema, it was a crowd-pleasing and cheering moment, but when he grabs it now, it's just a cool moment. A lot of the luster is sadly gone. Still though, 4.5 stars and a 94%, I still think it's an amazing movie. Spider-Man Far From Home is such a fun ride from start to finish, and I think it improves upon the first one entirely. I love Peter and MJ's dynamic. I really love all the classmates here. I think they have a little less character than they did in Homecoming, but I still think they're really fun to watch. I really like the humor and comedy as well. It can be a little messy and bad at some times, but you know what? MCU movie doesn't have bad comedy sometimes. Mysterio is easily my favorite MCU villain, and I can't think of one that I really enjoy more. I think a big part of that is because I love Jake Gyllenhaal and he's one of my favorite actors, but another part is just because he's such a great antagonist that makes the movie work entirely well. The scene where Peter is thrust into various visions by Mysterio is not only a fantastic moment in the movie writing wise, but also a visual marvel where everything just looks as spectacular as it is written. I also think the final act is fantastic. Anything from Peter talking to Happy and building the suit to the end of the movie is so good, and Mysterio's final plan against Peter is awesome. I love the scene where he uses the spider sense to take out the drones, and him stopping Mysterio is really cool. It's easily one of the best final acts of an MCU movie. There's definitely flaws. Sometimes it can feel a little too much like a high school Disney show, and I think the scene on the bus where Peter stops a drone is fucking awful, and Edith is not handled well throughout the movie. Mysterio comes into possession of it and it gets really cool, but otherwise it's a little eh. The middle of the movie, just like in Homecoming, drags a bit, but I think overall it's still really, really good. And the way the movie handles the events of Endgame is going to vary from person to person. I don't mind it, but I can see why some people dislike it. And I also see why people dislike the movie as a whole, but for me, I really, really love it. 4.5 stars and a 94%. And that's that. I've now talked about all 23 Marvel movies and wasted my life on watching them, writing reviews on them, and now writing these 3 scripts about them. Phase 3 is easily the best MCU phase. Sure, not every film is as amazing as Infinity War, but Phase 2 alternated between really good and really bad, and Phase 3 just kind of alternated between really good and, okay. Here are my ranking for all 23 films in the MCU, and I think overall the Marvel Cinematic Universe was a success, and managed to tell over 23 movies and make sure that most of them were good films on their own. There's definitely downsides all throughout, problems with the movies, the acting isn't as amazing, some missteps in character arcs, but at the end of the day, the MCU is really, really good. And I think throughout it all, they were able to tell a cohesive story while making sure that every movie someone watched was at least somewhat enjoyable. And that's how Marvel perfected a universe.